I'll put it on you, Paul.
So on October 25th, the WBO interim heavyweight champion Joseph Parker takes on the WBA interim heavyweight champion Fabio Wardley, a fight in which both men are risking the number one contender's position they have earned in the respective governing bodies whose route they have gone down. Now, of course, the full WBO and WBA world heavyweight titles are both held by the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Alexander Usyk, who of course also holds the WBC and IBF titles. Now, the way that this Parker vs Wardley fight is being sold is that the winner of this fight is the man to fight Alexander Usyk next. As an undisputed champion in the 4-belt era, you can have up to 4 mandatory challenges at once, or there are 4 different number 1 contenders for each of your belts. But 2 of the number 1 contenders for the versions of his crown are fighting each other here, so the winner of this Parker-Wardley fight is undeniably next in line for Usyk. And what the fight is also being sold as from a world title implications perspective is that if Usyk doesn't fight the winner will be upgraded to full world champion, specifically the full WBO world heavyweight champion, a belt that Parker held several years ago. Because when the belts are unified, there needs to be some type of agreed upon order of which governing body gets to enforce a mandatory next, and the WBO are next in line. The WBO have enforced Parker as the mandatory for Usyk's title. Of course, the winner of Parker vs Wardley will be the WBO interim champion. So if the WBO strip Usyk, the winner of Parker Wardley will be upgraded to full WBO champion. So Parker is the guy next in line for Usyk anyway, which is why Parker is being credited for taking the risk to fight Wardley. Parker could easily wait for Usyk to agree to fight him, and if Usyk doesn't fight him, Joseph Parker will be upgraded to full world champion. So Parker could have either got an undisputed title shot at Usyk, or got upgraded to a full world champion without taking any other fight in the meantime, but he will be fighting Fabio Wardley next month and putting his position on the line. But Fabio Wardley also grinded his way to WBA interim title status, and him and his team strategically went the WBA route and paid the necessary sanctioning fees to earn the number 1 position in the WBA rankings. So the WBA might not be next in line to enforce a mandatory at heavyweight like the WBO are, but the WBA would have been in position to force Wardley as a mandatory world title challenger at some point, providing he kept his position. So Wardley also could very well have eventually been in a position where he got upgraded to a full world champion without having to fight someone on the level of Joseph Parker. He could have stayed busy with an interim title defense against someone low down in the WBA top 15. So look, I know both guys are going to get paid handsomely for taking this fight because it's big name versus big name here, but world title wise, this is a risk they both didn't have to take. I'm not complaining at all because I do just want to see good fights, and it's not always about the politics. I'm just highlighting the world title politics right now. But the angle I'm going to come at this from right now is a bit of a different one. Forget about the winner either challenging Usyk for undisputed gold or being upgraded to full WBO world champion. Is there a world where the winner of this Parker vs Wardley fight will be upgraded to a unified world champion if Alexander Usyk doesn't fight them? Of course, the unified WBO and WBA world heavyweight champion. Some people are calling this fight interim versus interim, so that's why I thought I'd address that. Well, the fundamental question that we've got to ask ourselves first is whether or not both the WBO and WBA interim titles will even be on the line in this fight. Both Joseph Parker and Fabio Wardley are with Frank Warren's Queensberry Promotions. And in the press conference and his post-press conference interviews, Frank Warren's focus has been on the WBO. He's briefly mentioned the fact that Fabio Wardley is the WBA interim champ, but other than that, he has not said much about what's happening with the WBA title. Of course, Frank Warren acknowledged that the WBO are next in line to enforce a mandatory, and he spoke about that 90-day deadline that the WBO have given Usyk to fight Joseph Parker. Well, I think the 90-day deadline is for Usyk to negotiate a mandatory fight rather than actually fight within the 90 days. But either way, if Usyk doesn't agree to fight the WBO mandatory within the 90-day period, he will be stripped of the WBO belt. The WBO mandatory is of course currently Joseph Parker, but it will be Fabio Wardley if Wardley beats Parker on October 25th. But what Frank has said about Fabio Wardley's world title contendership is that it could be up to a couple years until it's the WBA's turn to enforce a mandatory. So by taking on the WBO mandatory Joseph Parker, the WBO who are next in line, Wardley is jumping the gun to earn his enforced mandatory shot at Usyk sooner. That might suggest that Wardley is ditching the WBA interim title to take on Parker for the WBO interim belt, but as per ESPN, both the WBO and WBA interim titles will be on the line in this fight. So yes, if we're taking this ESPN article for gospel because this is the only notable source mentioning whether or not the WBA interim belt is on the line as of right now, and they are saying it indeed is, the winner of Parker vs Wardley will essentially be a unified WBA interim and WBO interim world champion. I know the term unified only tends to pertain to full world champions, but interim titles can become full world titles. Okay, so for the winner of Parker versus Wardley to become a unified full world champion by being upgraded twice with the 2 interim belts, first, Team Usyk will have to fail to negotiate a fight with the winner of Parker versus Wardley by the time his deadline is over. If not, then the winner of Parker versus Wardley will be upgraded to the full WBO heavyweight champion of the world, as has been established many times. But surely in being upgraded to the full WBO world champion, they will then be stripped of the WBA interim title. Surely you can't hold an interim title from one governing body while being a full world champion in another. Interim title status is basically a mandatory position, and you can't even be ranked in any of the governing bodies while being a world champion of one. So surely if Parker beats Wardley as most people expect, he will just get his money, get his rounds in, pick up Wardley's WBA interim belt for the sake of it for a brief period, get upgraded to the full WBO world champion when Usyk refuses to fight him, just like he would have got upgraded without fighting Wardley anyway, then Parker will just get stripped of the WBA interim title. So all that would change in case of a Parker win is that Wardley just loses his WBA interim title, right? But let's ask ourselves, in recent times, have we seen a boxer hold a full world title in one governing body and an interim world title in another at the same time? Yes, we have, that being one Terence Crawford. When Terence Crawford challenged for Israel Madrimov's WBA junior middleweight title, the vacant WBO interim junior middleweight title was put on the line for the fight. This is because the full WBO junior middleweight champion Sebastian Fondora was injured at the time of the Crawford vs Madrimov fight, which was August 2024. But now, Terence Crawford, who remains the WBA junior middleweight champion to this day, voluntarily vacated that WBO interim strap in March of 2025, and this was before Fondora was stripped of his full world title in May of 2025. So in theory, Crawford would have been upgraded to full WBO junior middleweight champion if he had kept that interim title and didn't go for that Canelo fight up at super middleweight. So Crawford would have become a unified world champion by way of being upgraded from an interim champ. But that would have just been with one of the belts. Crawford did win his WBA belt off of the defending world champion, so he wouldn't have got upgraded twice in that scenario. So maybe when the winner of Parker Wardley, the would-be WBO and WBA interim champ, gets upgraded to full WBO champ, they will be stripped of the WBA interim belt because potentially being upgraded twice and becoming a unified world champion by that means would be insane, and that's definitely never happened before. But let's say the winner of Parker Wardley did in theory keep the WBA interim belt after being elevated to full WBO champ. Two important questions are: 1. When is it the WBA's turn to actually enforce a mandatory? And 2. Does being the WBA interim champ put you in line to be upgraded to the Super WBA World Champion if that title gets vacated, the belt that Usyk holds, or the WBA regular world title if that one is vacated?
The regular title which is held by Kubrat Pulev.
The WBA having 2 world titles really just messes everything up, doesn't it? So the reason why enforced mandatory shots in the heavyweight division have been so few and far between in recent times is because for the last 7.5 years, at least 3 of the 4 world heavyweight title belts have been unified together at each point in time. So each governing body's mandatory enforcements are fewer and further between when there's a 3-belt unified champ or undisputed champ in the division, of course. But the WBA regular title stuff even messes up the question of when the WBA last had a mandatory fight at heavyweight. So in 2023, the WBA ordered the WBA Super Champ Usyk, who also held the WBO and IBF titles, to fight the WBA regular champion Daniel Dubois. And Usyk won the fight to become the lone WBA world champ of the heavyweight division, so to speak. Assuming we count the WBA Super and regular consolidation fights, as they call it, to be a mandatory shot, then the WBA last had a mandatory fight at heavyweight in 2023. The last time that somebody who wasn't a regular champion was enforced as a mandatory for the WBA Super title at heavyweight was when Povetkin was mandatory for AJ in 2018. Anyway, counting Usyk vs Dubois 1 as a mandatory fight, the WBA have had a mandatory fight at heavyweight more recently than the WBC have. The WBO are next in line now. The IBF was last before that in 2024. The WBA had that mandatory in 2023, and the WBC haven't had a mandatory fight since 2022. So if that pattern continues, even if the winner of Parker vs Wardley gets upgraded to full WBO world champion before 2025 ends, 2026 will be the WBC's year of a mandatory heavyweight challenger, and their interim champ right now is Ajit Caballero. So let's say Usyk is still the unified WBC, WBA and IBF champ when the WBC enforced Caballero as the mandatory. Usyk will have to defend against Caballero, or Usyk will be stripped of the WBC title and Caballero will get upgraded to full WBC heavyweight champion of the world. And now let's say Usyk still holds the WBA Super title in 2027. Well, if Kubrat Pulev still holds the regular belt, Pulev would be the one to fight Usyk or get upgraded to Super Champ if Usyk didn't fight him. I mean, the regular champion is above the interim champion, so they are more in line for the Super title, right? But where does that leave the interim champion, providing the winner of Parker versus Wardley still holds that in 2027? Well, they'd be upgraded to regular champ, right? So forget about fast forward into when the WBA will next enforce a mandatory at heavyweight, which will likely be 2027. Let's say that Joseph Parker does beat Fabio Wardley, yeah? Sorry to do that again. And Parker is the full WBO world champ and the WBA interim champ. Does he get enforced as a mandatory for Pulev's WBA regular world title at some point? And let's say Parker beats Pulev or Pulev vacate and then Parker gets upgraded to WBA regular champ. Would Parker be considered as a unified heavyweight champion of the world as the WBO full world champ and the WBA regular world champ? Well, as long as somebody still holds the WBA super title, the answer is no. David Benavidez is currently the full WBC champ at light heavyweight, so yes, he is a legit world champion, and he also holds the WBA regular world title too, but he is not considered a unified world champion because Dmitry Bivol is the actual WBA champ of that weight class. But there is a chance that Kubrat Pulev will just retire at some point. I mean, he is 44, and the WBA interim champ Parker would then be upgraded to regular champ and be the WBA super champion Alexander Usyk's next WBA mandatory without a shadow of a doubt. And he would be upgraded to super champ if Usyk still didn't want to fight him in 2027. This is a headache, ain't it? But what would throw even more of a spanner into the works is if somebody beats Kubrat Pulev for that regular title and then that guy wants to fight Usyk. That would lead to being upgraded from WBA interim champ all the way up to WBA super champion anytime in the next few years be an absolute myth in all likelihood. So to answer the question, could the winner of Joseph Parker versus Fabio Wardley become a unified world champion without dethroning any defending world champion or fighting in a vacant world title fight? Yes, it is possible, but a very specific order of events would have to play out. Pretty much, Usyk would have to not agree to fight the winner of Parker versus Wardley, so the winner of Parker Wardley will get upgraded to full WBO world champion first, which is not very unlikely. But then, the WBA would have to not strip them of their interim title after being upgraded to full champion in another governing body. And then by 2027 probably, the winner of Parker vs Wardley would have to still hold the WBO full world title and either the WBA interim title with no regular champion being in the fray, or the actual WBA regular title if they were to get elevated to regular status between now and then. And whoever holds the WBA super title at that time would also have to refuse to fight them. So yeah, that's a bit convoluted, ain't it? But as I said, the winner of this upcoming fight becoming the full WBO world champion by way of elevation is quite likely. It's just the WBA stuff that's an absolute reach. Now, all of the WBA interim stuff aside, personally, if Joseph Parker does beat Fabio Wardley as we all expect, I don't want to see Joseph Parker elevated to full WBO world champ. I actually want to see the Parker versus Usyk fight. Other than Caballero and Parker, there's no one else who's really worthy of fighting Usyk right now. And Parker is next up as far as I see it. Well, he is literally next up according to the WBO, but yeah, to me, Parker versus Usyk is just the fight to make at heavyweight. I'd rather the fight actually happens than Usyk vacating the WBO belt and fighting somebody else. Look, Joseph Parker had his world title shot against Daniel Dubois in February for the IBF belt, and that opportunity got unjustly snatched away from him last minute. And even if you are of the belief that Daniel Dubois was genuinely ill, why did that mean that Dubois didn't need to reschedule a fight with Parker and he just got a shot at undisputed against Usyk instead a few months later? By the way, Usyk now has 58 days to negotiate a fight with the WBO mandatory as of this upload because the 90-day negotiating period was retroactively made effective from August 9th by the WBO. But of course, Usyk will have to wait and see who wins out of Parker and Wardley to negotiate with the winner of that fight, the would-be WBO mandatory. So essentially, after that October 25th fight, Team Usyk will have 13 days to negotiate a fight with the winner in order to not get stripped of the WBO belt. Anyway, thanks for watching and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.